Chris Fowler for Sports Century. He was gangling and splay-legged and looked better suited for pulling a plow. And even the bargain basement price that bought him seemed outrageous. But the ugly duckling grew into a swan with afterburners. And when Seattle's Slew won the Triple Crown in 1977, he captured the love and loyalty of all those railbirds for whom answered prayers are forever just one race away.
One of the great things about thoroughbred racing is that all the $4 million yearlings don't turn out to be the champions. Sometimes there's a quality inside them that you can't measure or know is there. Competitiveness, an ability to win races that you couldn't have predicted otherwise.
In July of 1975, a lumberman, a former flight attendant, and a veterinarian went to the annual yearling sale in Lexington, Kentucky. With a combined stake that amounted to bar change for most thoroughbred owners, the three shared an almost impossible dream.
It was raining, cats and dogs, and he walked out in the mud and wouldn't really stand still. I mean, he had energy. And his whole right front leg kind of turned out, and, you know, he looked like an athlete.
$15,000 was kind of what we could spend on this horse, and so when I knew it was going to be over that, I just had to give him a little elbow, you know. I mean, I really wanted him because there was something special about him.
I'm bid 14, 15, Bruce Shirt 15, 15, 16, 16.
We went to 16, and I got an elbow from Karen, and then I went to 16.5, and then he went to 17.
17.5, 18,000, 17.5, 18,000, all through it, 17.5. Bill, 17.5.
Boy, when he walked out of there, he just looked like he just never quit coming. He was just so big and strong and magnificent. And I said to Mickey, I said, Mick, if this isn't a racehorse, my name's not Jim Hill.
The phone rang very late that night. I think it was around 11:30. Jim woke up and answered the phone, and he turned to me and he said, we just bought a champion.
But whatever they saw in the yearling, it was not evident, much less visible, to more experienced horse people who thought the colt was a dud.
He was one of those horses that was really backward when he was a yearling. They called him Baby Huey. He was sloppy and dumb and couldn't figure it out.
He had a slight resemblance to a mule. He was a great horse, but not quite what you want in a hero.
You know, 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and Jim said, we've got to go see the yearlings. And by the car's headlights, we drove up to the field, and they all took off running, except one, and he just stood there. And Jim went right up to him, and he said, isn't he beautiful? And I looked at him, and I said, Jim, that's got to be the ugliest horse I've ever seen.
His legs were going everywhere, his head was going everywhere, his mouth was wide open. He just wanted to run, but didn't know how to do it.
But he would learn. Led by trainer Billy Turner, the crew began the involved process of teaching the youngster the disciplines of racing. And in the summer of 1976, the 2-year-old turned heads working out at Saratoga.
The first time he let Seattle Slew breeze in company with another horse, he put a real nice filly on the track with him, and he said, in his own words, suddenly Seattle Slew got competitive.
He all of a sudden realized this was a competitive situation, and he was on his way. And that's all I had to see. He showed us right there that he could really run.
Leroy Jolly had a 2-year-old named For the Moment that he was thinking was the best 2-year-old in America. He sees Seattle Slew, and he goes to the telephone, and he calls his owners. And he said to them, we've got a problem.
Seattle Slew in front by 2.5 lengths. Through the stretch, Seattle Slew going easily in front.
At Belmont, Seattle Slew with Jean Cruguet up won his first 2 races, setting the stage for his first big test, the prestigious Champagne Stakes.
We knew one thing, that if you win the Champagne, you're the favorite for the Kentucky Derby.
And I thought, well, he probably can't get a mile on the 16th, you know. Because now we're going into a distance race.
There was a lot of interest for this race after Seattle Slew had won those 2 races the way he did. It was just a beautiful fall day, and there was a big crowd, and we got in the paddock, and all the horses came in except for Seattle Slew. And all of a sudden, out of the tunnel and up the path comes Seattle Slew.
And they're up. On the extreme outside, cruise on in, going for the lead. For the moment, ranging up on the inside, and there goes Seattle Slew, quickly taking the lead.
The one thing that defined him was his speed. When you see a horse who is like blazingly fast, who just always goes to the lead and runs as far and fast as he can, I mean, that's the kind of horse, I think gives every racing fan goosebumps.
It's Seattle Slew in front by a length and a half. For the moment is second by 4.
And here comes For the Moment around the turn, and all of a sudden, Slew just put it into that overdrive.
Seattle Slew now draws away to lead by 5. Seattle Slew in front by 8 lengths. Seattle Slew going easily.
He drew off and won laughing, and now everybody's serious about this horse. This horse is the real deal.
He ran the fastest mile ever run by a 2-year-old at Belmont Park. This was the dominant 2-year-old of the year. No question about it.
Seattle Slew climbed the charts when he was voted top 2-year-old. Owners who hadn't given him a second glance at auction in 1975 could no longer ignore him. One who praised the colt was noted trainer Leroy Jolly.
Leroy called me and asked me if we'd sell Seattle Slew. He said he'd be willing to pay us $1 million for the horse. And I just told him, Leroy, I don't think we're interested in doing that.
And then Jim hung up the phone, and I said, what was that? And he said that someone wanted to buy the colt. And I said, well, what did he offer? And he said $1 million. So I said, couldn't we have even discussed it? And Jim said, don't even think about it. We'll never look back at that.
Now with a 16th of a mile to go, it's Seattle Slew showing the way by 4 lengths.
Seattle Slew is in front, and as they say in rocking chair ride for jockey John Truget, Seattle Slew with his ears pricked, being eased at the finish, and here's the time, 1:47.2.
He announced for all the world that anybody had any aspirations for the Triple Crown, they better just head elsewhere. Go to the Illinois Derby, go to the New Jersey Derby, but go anywhere but the Kentucky Derby.
Dominating the competition at Hialeah in March of 1977, the 3-year-old had gained an intimidating presence.
You'd look at Slew in the stall, he'd look like an ordinary horse. But when you got him in the paddock, the muscles would just keep building. And then he'd turn his head a little bit like this, and he'd look very determined. And he said, my God, I'm glad we have him under control.
He would just draw himself up into a kind of a ball, just a real tight frame, and duck his head down and prance, and boy, the fire was coming out of his nose.
He was a bully. He would knock his way through horses if he had to. He would do anything that he had to win.
You had a sense that if he had been a teenager, he'd have been quite a thug.
He looked like the divine tailor had made his coat one size too small because he popped out of it. This horse had muscles on his eyebrows. He had muscles bulging all over the place.
Seattle Slew was a tough horse. He was all boy all the time, 24 hours a day. He was almost the anti-hero. He was like Mike Tyson with the dark trunks, no socks, just the gladiator.
He embodied all of the traits that you would need. He was strong, and he was tough, and he was quick, and he had reactions.
He was really conceited, arrogant, and cocky. And one of the hallmarks of this is that I'm going to the lead, and if anybody can keep up with me, good luck.
But more than mere physical appeal, it was his low purchase price and middle-class ownership that endeared Seattle Slew to millions. He was every man's horse, living proof that anyone had a chance to be a player in this game, once considered the sport of kings.
Many people dismissed him because he wasn't a classic horse. He came cheaply. His owners were not aristocrats from Kentucky. Seattle Slew was the people's horse, the poor people's horse.
Most of the $2 bettors probably look at themselves as people who have to earn their way in life, much like he did.
Many, many people said, my God, I had $17,500. I had saved that. I could have had that horse. It put it on a level that a lot of people could understand.
It just wasn't the traditional racing story of some very aloof, wealthy people with a fine horse. These were kind of regular people you might see across the street from the track at the diner.
The press loved us because we were different. And all we knew, if we could take good care of that horse, we'd do well.
Keeping Seattle Slew healthy, happy, and motivated was former steeplechase jockey and man of the people, Billy Turner.
He used to hang out at Esposito's bar right across the street from Belmont Park, and his nickname was Turnpike Turner, because even though he might be in the bar well on his way with a few beers under his belt, somebody might need a jockey in a pinch, and they would call Esposito's Turner to hop in his car and go down the turnpike and show up in time and ride the race.
Billy Turner was a very likable, very young horseman. He wasn't your prototypical Triple Crown trainer, graybeard, crusty, old wise man.
A lot of trainers probably would have just pressed and pressed and pressed, but Billy was very, very patient with the horse.
On the surface, he appeared to be a happy-go-lucky guy, but I think he also felt a lot more pressure in handling that horse than probably people realized.
There's so many details that go along with training a horse like this. It's much more time-consuming than I had thought possible.
Billy was not used to the limelight, and he was very nervous. He said to me, "I'm really scared about this horse because he's so great. I can't possibly make him better. The only thing I can do is screw him up."
Having run 5 flawless races in his young career, Seattle Slew faced one last trial before the 1977 Kentucky Derby. On the day of the Wood Memorial at Aqueduct, his trainer had a strong reservation.
I thought, well, if they're ever going to beat him, they can beat him today because he's going to come up a little short for this race.
A furlong to the finish. Seattle Slew has the lead by 5 lengths. That's Sanhedrin on the outside, now second Papalote and Catalan. Past the 70-yard mark, and it's Seattle Slew in front.
Still unbeaten and unchallenged, the sensational auction purchase arrived at Churchill Downs as the odds-on favorite to win the Kentucky Derby.
Churchill Downs, the familiar scene of the Twin Spires here in Louisville, Kentucky, for the 103rd running of the Kentucky Derby.
But as Jean Cruguet rode him out of the paddock, it appeared something was wrong with Seattle Slew.
It wasn't really a hot day at all. Few of the other horses were sweating, but Slew was sweating ferociously because he hated the paddock. And by the time he got to the gate, he was almost insane.
Seattle Slew has broke out, and he's lathering all over. His neck is lathering, and really that's not a good sign. The Derby could be getting to him, Howard.
It was very congested. People were actually reaching through and pulling hair on his tail, and water was pouring off of him. And Karen and I are standing there telling ourselves to breathe.
And I looked at Billy, and the only person who was sweating more than Slew was Billy.
You think, God, he's going to run his race before he ever gets to the starting gate, but that was Slew. He was like ready, on go. His batteries were like overcharged. All you had to do was point him in the right direction and off he'd go.
Slew broke slowly. Breaking on the lead is Bob's Dusty on the inside. For the moment, showing speed on the outside, gets the lead.
And the very first thing I heard the track announcer say, Seattle Slew breaks poorly. And he did. And he was sort of trapped behind most of the horses in that field. Cruguet was lucky he didn't go off.
When he came out of the gate, a wall of horses appeared in front of him. And little hole appears, boom, he goes right through it.
Seattle Slew has moved up along the inside and has moved into second.
Just sort of barged his way through. He just went, boom. And it was like a bowling ball and bowling pins. He just said, look, get out of my way, I'm going.
Coming by us, for the moment, the leader, a half Seattle Slew, now draws alongside.
Before they passed the wire the first time, Cruguet brushed 3 horses aside and took second behind the pace setter.
For the moment is along the inside, ahead in front. Seattle Slew is second.
Horses don't run the first quarter of a mile in the Kentucky Derby that way and get away with it. And I thought he's fatally compromised.
I'm thinking to myself, that had to take its toll on Seattle Slew. So this has to be a tired horse now. Well, he just kept running.
Head of the stretch. For the moment, Seattle Slew still battling it out together.
He was Seattle Slew right next to me. And I said, wow, this horse came in quick. And I looked, and there he was, like this, like looking at me. Never noticed a horse that can look at it, but he was looking at me. But Seattle Slew just kept looking at me, passed me, and took every other challenge from behind. And I said to myself, that horse is a champion.
It's Seattle Slew, however, that takes it over at the head of the stretch. Seattle Slew moving away, now opens 2.5.
Once he swung into stride, there was going to be any stopping him. I mean, he was clearly the class of that field, and you knew that it was going to be Slew's day.
Coming to the wire, Seattle Slew opens it to 4 lengths. At the finish, it's going to be Seattle Slew, and he's going along the
Seattle Slew had terrible luck in that race. A very good horse might overcome trouble and win any one of a number of races, but it really, really takes a special animal to have so much trouble in the Kentucky Derby and still win.
He did overcome adversity. He did stumble at the start. He did have to fight his way through. But at the end, there he was, and there was no denying the fact that he was the best horse on the track that day.
There was no feeling of gratification having won the Derby because there's still 2 more. I could not enjoy the Derby because I had the horse to win it all, and if I didn't win it all, I didn't do my job.
Despite the character he showed in winning the Derby, Seattle Slew's muzzle was still pressed against the window of that realm occupied by owners who not only live by the dictum that thoroughbred blood is thicker than water, but the bluer it is, the better.
Most people kept thinking that Seattle Slew was a fluke, that he doesn't have what it takes. He doesn't have the pedigree to be a great horse, much less a Triple Crown winner.
And Andy Beyer picked Cormorant to beat him in a Preakness, and there were a lot of people that thought Cormorant might beat him.
I was not all that impressed. I think her case could have made that he really was somewhat overrated.
They break away. The outside is Seattle Slew. One dusty run down long rail at Cormorant.
This was going to be the one time in the Triple Crown series that another horse looked Seattle Slew in the eye, and they raced head and head.
Swing around the clubhouse turn. It's Seattle Slew on the outside. Cormorant along the rail. His match tries as they swing around the turn.
Seattle Slew was the boss. And he acted like it from the start to the finish. Anytime he wanted them, I got you. That extra overdrive.
It's Seattle Slew. Iron Constitution charging on the outside. Coming on to the finish. Seattle Slew hits one by 2 lengths. Well, there he is. Seattle Slew has taken another step on the road to greatness, winning the Preakness Stakes in 1:54 2/5. That's just 2/5 off the record set by Cañonero II.
After the Preakness, which he dominated, more people became believers. After all, he did win 2 of the 3, so you had to take him seriously now, and I think the public did.
Standing tall on 2 legs of the Triple Crown, the horse continued to gain popularity at the pari-mutuels and even won over a few of racing's old guard. But the owners were starting to annoy some members of the media.
We were besieged by the media. They'd duck under the rail and would run up to the horse and everything. So we kind of got stern about keeping people out. We certainly didn't want them disrupting the normal flow of the training regimen for Seattle Slew and the rest of the barn.
They were extremely arrogant. And they said, of course we knew how to build. We chose this horse. We are something special, which set them up as targets for the racing community. And so they aroused resentment in the racing community.
Any words come to your mind, Karen?
Oh, fantastic.
Mickey?
It was beautiful. We didn't have the smoothest trip, but it was great.
These were new kids on the block, and a lot of the hard boots in Kentucky resented the fact that, first of all, they were making a lot of money off of a cheaply bought horse, and I think there was a lot of strong-willed sentiment against the horse for that reason.
As the Belmont Stakes approached, Seattle Slew's detractors shifted their handicapping spells and hexes from the horse to its French-born jockey.
Jean Cruguet will not be recorded in history as a great jockey. Matter of fact, there were a lot of people who thought it was amazing that he would have this mount on this great horse.
I didn't have much confidence in him as a judge of pace and that sort of thing. Maybe I was a little unfair with him, but I never regarded him as a top rider.
There was pressure to replace Cruguet as the jockey and get somebody who had more experience and a much more distinguished record in the Triple Crown races, but they were very reluctant to break up the team.
All you had to do was sit a little guy on Seattle Slew and let him hold the reins right.
As it turned out, that Cruguet was the ideal rider for that particular horse. He was absolutely fearless, and by showing absolutely no emotion to it whatsoever, made the horse easier to handle.
A crowd of more than 70,000 built at Belmont Park on June 11th, 1977. causing Billy Turner concern that his horse would react to the fans that were sure to mob the grandstand rail as they did at Churchill Downs.
Slew was a very temperamental, headstrong horse, and Billy wanted him to be the last one into the paddock. He wanted to saddle him very quickly and get him out on the track so he wouldn't be exposed to that crowd.
Slew saw all these cars and the different atmosphere and everything at Belmont, and he was very curious, and he would stop and look.
We had a record crowd, and they were parking cars in the stable area, and the place was jammed everywhere. The owners were getting nervous about where in the hell is Turner and the horse.
Well, maybe 100 people came up and said, "Where's your horse? Where's your horse? Where's your horse?"
He's had some bad paddock experiences in the early part of his career, and obviously Billy Turner does not want a repeat of that.
Billy was like Napoleon plotting a strategy here, and he knows the longer Slew is in the paddock, the more problems might arise. If you even coughed near Seattle Slew, he might jump to the sky.
I've been preparing for this all my life. Thought if I ever had the chance, I didn't want to make a mistake.
I was getting nervous, and I went up to him finally, and I said, "Billy," I said, "don't you think you better get over there?" And he kind of looked at me, and he winked, and he said, "You don't think they'll start without us, do you?"
And now, coming through the crowd, comes the star of the day.
Arriving about 20 minutes late at the paddock, Seattle Slew will be fined $200. But once the bell rang and the gates opened, the great horse moved with purpose, staying within the field.
And they're off. For the lead on the inside. Now Seattle Slew goes for the lead. He has the lead as they move through the stretch.
I remember the first fractions were unbelievably slow. I thought, "Oh, is there anything wrong with this horse?"
Then on the backstretch, Seattle Slew picked up the pace, his legs gathering ground with the steadiness of a locomotive leaving town.
He was moving so easy that Gene never even tapped him. And man, he opened up 5 or 6 around the quarter pole. It was over with. Dude, I mean, you'd have to have the airplane to catch him.
It's Seattle Slew holding on, however, and now he pulls away to a length again. Spirit Level is second ahead, and Run Dusty Run is third.
I looked up and I said, it's all over. Because he can sprint home from there.
In the stretch, here he comes, and he's opening up again. It's Seattle Slew, and he's drawing clear of the field. Seattle Slew has 4 lengths on Run Dusty Run. It's Run Dusty Run in second, and Sam Hedren third. They're nearing the finish line. It's still Seattle Slew, and he's opened it up to 4.5. Then Run Dusty Run and Sam Hedren.
When Gene Cruguet raised his stick before he crosses the finish line, my first thought was, don't fall off. My second was, yes.
Winning the mile-and-a-half race by 4 lengths, Seattle Slew indelibly imprinted himself on American turf history. The 10th Triple Crown winner, he was the only horse to have won the honor without suffering a single loss. Like Secretariat 4 years earlier, the powerful Dark Bay captured the imagination of a nation.
I was a little boy who was infatuated with the Black Stallion series by Walter Farley. And I remember meeting Walter Farley, and he told me, he said, all my life I've looked for the Black Stallion. And Seattle Slew is my Black Stallion.
The Belmont Stakes meant everything to Seattle Slew. It wasn't the end of the story of Seattle Slew by any means.
At a time when marketing and promotion techniques had taken a quantum leap, Seattle Slew's celebrity rivaled that of Secretariat's, at least in the short run.
I think they felt something akin to an obligation to share this horse, and I think they had a sense of really understanding that this horse belongs to the public, not just me.
They ended up doing a lot of merchandising, television commercials. They were on TV all the time. But I don't think they really thought that this would hurt the horse. I thought that they thought that the horse was capable of handling it.
They had Seattle Slew glasses, Seattle Slew T-shirts. He became a freak, a curiosity, a sales piece.
All of a sudden, this horse was a commercial commodity. I wasn't geared in for that, and didn't understand it. Because it was all new. It was all new to everyone.
As we've seen many times in different sports, people that have a lot of success very quickly, I think sometimes it kind of goes to your head, and maybe you think you're a little bit smarter than you really are.
We wanted the world to see this horse, but I think that you just have to have the horse tell you. And If the horse was ready to go someplace, we would have gone if it was in his best interest.
They just caught up in the emotion of it. They thought the horse was invincible. They thought the ride would never end. Perhaps there's an element of greed in it. Who could blame them?
It was fun. It was exciting. But we also wanted to keep on running that horse. So the job wasn't over.
In the frenetic aftermath of Belmont, Slew's owners broke with tradition and shipped him to the West Coast to run on the Swaps Stakes.
You could see at the time it was a terrible decision. A horse who's been through the rigors of the Triple Crown should not then be taken out on a national circus tour. He is supposed to be given the summer off.
Billy Turner thought the horse really deserved a rest, but the owners became enamored with the idea of going to California and running in the Swap Stakes.
He'd done everything you could ask of him. I figured it'd be just natural to give him a break.
The day he was going to ship to California, my husband said to Billy Turner, and he will not get on the airplane if you have any doubts whatsoever. And there were none.
Seattle Slew was the most famous horse in the world at the time. Hollywood Park went whole hog to try to get the Slew crew to bring the horse west.
When you have a good horse that does things like Slew did, you do get to feeling invincible.
They believed that it was going to be an easy spot. Head on out there, remain unbeaten, win the race, and go on with this 3-year-old campaign. But they were in for a rude awakening.
Using his best body language, Seattle Slew tried to speak up.
Slew was telling us, guys, I'm a little bit tired. Slew told us. We just didn't listen.
I was numb when I was in California. I tried not to think about it. I just never had a good feeling about it.
It didn't work the way he normally worked. We should have just scratched right then. Of course, it would have been pretty tough to scratch with all the hoopla that was going on.
There were fans on the backstretch of Hollywood Park in the stable area lining the road where Seattle Slew would walk around the corner of the clubhouse turn and into the receiving area for the Swap Stakes. I'd never seen anything like that before.
He resembled one of those Clydesdales out there that pulls the bud wagons between the races.
And Seattle Slew is dropping back. Seattle Slew is well beaten.
As they were turning into the stretch and J.O. Tobin was drawing off, and I remember just my jaw dropping. It was like, oh my God, he's going to get beat.
I had a minute, and then knowing that we were going to get beat. That's the longest minute you're ever going to spend in your life.
J.O. Tobin, affiliate on the outside in Tex, and J.O. Tobin is the winner by 8.5 lengths.
Finishing out of the money for the only time in his career, Seattle Slew struggled home 16 lengths off the pace set by winner J.O. Tobin.
It was a colossal blunder, and it erased some of the greatness that this horse had achieved. I think sometimes people, start to think that the horses are completely invincible, and they are flesh and bones, and you can't do those sort of things to them.
I was forbidden to talk to the press after the race. I was taken to the airport and get on my plane to go back to New York.
He could have beaten J.O. Tobin probably 99 out of 100 times, but that was the one time that he shouldn't have been in the race against J.O. Tobin or maybe anybody else. And he wasn't up to it, and it was one of the biggest upsets of all time.
Drew on one of my old favorite characters, Don Quixote. And I said, we carried the impossible dream one step too far.
Hollywood Park had put up some appearance money for the horse to come out there, so there was some incentive for him.
It was devastating for the Taylors and Hills, knowing that the decision to even go out there was being questioned by virtually everybody in the sport.
It certainly soiled the image of the Hills and the Taylors in the eyes of the press. They felt that Billy Turner had been badly used, and they came out like these greedy people who went out to California to win a pot of money with a horse who deserved better. They thought the horse was invincible, and when something went wrong, somebody had to be blamed, and it was Billy.
That was the beginning of the end, of Billy Turner and Seattle Slew. Now, suddenly, his decisions are being second-guessed.
But Turner was drinking heavily in those days. He was very irresponsible. His life was totally disorganized.
Everybody knew Billy was drinking hard, And when you have an investment like that, you can't show up in the morning and have your trainer show up drunk,
And my husband said, go off and get yourself straightened out, get some help, and he just wouldn't do it. And finally, they said, you know, if you can't straighten this out, Billy, we're going to have to take the horse away from you.
He was making some errors in the management of his horses. We tried to help him with his problems, but Billy was not receptive to the help. And so we just had to pick up and leave.
Late in 1977, the trainer was turned loose.
Business decision had been made, and I'm an employee. But that was the first time that I was ever questioned on anything that I did with the horse. Anything.
Well, how many times have you seen it happen where success spoils all the fun? In some ways, it's inevitable when you go in with modest means and low expectations, and suddenly you have a monster on your hands. Now, they look great standing at the top of the world. Everybody looked like couples on a wedding cake. And in one fell swoop, that was all gone. Suddenly, these people were in retreat. The honeymoon was not only over, it was crashingly over.
Hoping to redeem themselves in their own eyes and those of the entire racing world, the Seattle Slew crew, with new trainer Doug Peterson, faced a crisis more serious than embarrassment.
Mike Kennedy took his temperature and was normal at 5 o'clock. And Doug put his hand on Slew. He says, Mike, take his temperature again. And he says, Mike says, what? They took his temperature and it was 101. Doc got there about an hour later. He was 104.
By that evening, his fever still hadn't broken. And the next day, he had inflammation in the vein that we had used to administer the drugs to him.
He went from the toughest stud to being just kind, like, you know, I got to get through this. Help me out, people. Somebody's got to help me. And it was a tough time.
After Seattle Slew survived a near-fatal viral infection, his owners sold half interest in his future to a syndicate for $6 million in February of 1978. But the skeptics who attempted to devalue his accomplishments of a year earlier once more raised their voices.
Within a year's time, this horse went from being a Triple Crown winner to almost being the butt of jokes, and his career practically disintegrated.
In May of 1978, the 4-year-old began a comeback. After winning impressively in 2 allowance races, his owners considered matching him against the most recent Triple Crown winner, Affirmed. But before they could meet, Seattle Slew suffered a setback at the Patterson Handicap.
Dr. Patches on the outside. On the rail at Seattle Slew. They're heading stride for stride. Dr. Patches on the outside. Seattle Slew on the rail. Those 2 to the wire.
I went back in the jockey room to interview Kruge, and Kruge made some comments which implied that Seattle Slew was short. And I knew at the time that Kruge just signed his dismissal certificate.
Jean Kruge was replaced by the hard-riding Angel Cordero later that September. His mission, bring Seattle Slew home first against Affirmed in the Marlboro Cup.
The meeting between Seattle Slew and Affirmed really captivated the public imagination, and it was one of those rare races that engaged the imagination of the average sports fan and not just the racing fan. There was also a feeling that Affirmed was absolutely the crowd favorite.
Everyone's saying Affirmed, Affirmed, Affirmed. It's the first time ever that he's not the favorite.
The wheels had come off. The horse got beat. The trainer got changed. The horse was sick. There were accusations that they were not really wanting to run him, that they changed riders. Even with all that, it stunned me that some of the crowd booed the Slew when he came into the paddock.
And a lot of Seattle Slew fans were just licking their chops at the opportunity to say, hey, wait a second, don't forget about Seattle Slew.
He happened to walk into the one hole, which was a Affirmed stall. And as soon as he got close to the stall, he started bouncing around. And I said, I don't know if intimidation works in animals, but as I bet that Affirmed must be scared of these horses walking around.
The main thing that Angel and I and Doug talked about was all Affirmed's going to see is Slew's big black butt.
I knew that he was a great horse always. I knew he had the heart. I knew he had the speed. I knew he had the intelligence.
And they're off.
For the lead, a firm break sharply on the inside, Seattle Slew on the outside.
Seattle Slew just took over from the beginning, and it was a wonderful exhibition of greatness by both horses.
As they move for the main track, the leader is Seattle Slew by 2. Affirmed to second by 1 length.
I don't think that I gave him too much rope or let him get too away from me. The fact was that he was not going to be beaten on that day.
Nearing the finish, Seattle Slew has it by 4. Affirmed, Fireback, Nasty, and Bold. At the wire, it's going to be Seattle Slew.
It absolutely turned his career and his reputation around. If Seattle Slew had been beaten 5 lengths that day by Affirmed, I think Seattle Slew would be thought of now as some kind of accidental Triple Crown winner who came along and got lucky.
To further underline Seattle Slew's greatness, he was entered against Affirmed again in the Jockey Club Gold Cup at Belmont.
I think American race fans like a noble loser just as much as they do a spectacular winner.
And they're up for the lead. Seattle Slew along the inside, then Affirmed on the outside. It's Lights Hope.
Affirmed and Seattle Slew went through 6 furlongs in 1:09 and change. It was just an unbelievable speed duel between these two.
On the turn, still Slew. He's got it 2.5. Affirmed is picking up a bit of ground on the turn.
All of a sudden, Affirmed saddle slip, and he drops out of it. Seattle Slew's in front, but he's got to be dead tired. And Bill Shoemaker, who rode Exceller, was just sitting back off of that suicidal speed duel, knowing he was going to pick up the pieces.
So I figured this is the time to give my horse a chance to breathe. Now all of a sudden something told me, turn around, and I turned around, and he was Exceller. For line.
Here comes Exceller. He's got it in gear. He's flying now at the leader.
I shot up on the inside of him before he knew I was there. And he tried to pinch me off, but he couldn't. I was already there. And we came down the stretch, head and head, and Seattle Slew was coming back at me again.
It's Exceller along the inside. Seattle Slew on the outside. This is a real battle on the wire. But Exceller gets a narrow lead as they pass the 16th hole. Seattle Slew coming back again. At the finish, this is going to be tight.
I've never seen a horse so ennobled by defeat, because that was one of the rare times when Slew was kind of put to a character test, and he certainly passed.
And even though he lost that, I think that race, as much as anything, really showed the breeders and showed horse people that Seattle Slew is indeed a truly great horse.
At Aqueduct in November of 1978, Seattle Slew ran his last race before a blue-collar following that had stayed strong through his career.
It was the perfect ending to Seattle Slew's career to have his last appearance be at Aqueduct. And it was really like letting him lead the post parade one more time.
The whip still down as Cordero now hand-riding out to the finish line. 1 mile in 34 and 2, going for that record with a 16th to go. Seattle Slew. Ladies and gentlemen, here he is, the champion of the world, Seattle Slew.
Well, all of a sudden realize that you're not going to be able to walk out there on a Saturday afternoon and see Seattle Slew run. Feel your heart do what it does when that horse does his thing. It was certainly an emotional time for us, but we'd planned for it. We knew there was a time to run and there's a time to go to the breeding shed.
In direct contradiction to what racing's old guard thought of him, Seattle Slew proved that winning was in his genes. Time and again, he forged greatness into his offspring.
Seattle Slew has turned out to be a tremendously important sire. People at first thought, well, maybe we couldn't beat him on the racetrack, but when he gets to the breeding shed, we'll finally expose him for the blue-collar front runner that he really was.
He sired Swale, who won the Derby in '84, just went on to have an improbable but a spectacular impact on the game as a breeding stallion. And yet it seemed like he somehow managed to maintain his youth. You could go out there years after he had left the track, and he looked like he was ready to go out and run again.
He'd be so full of himself, and he'd be happy. And it's almost like he'd look around and say, did you see me out there? Did you see I can still do this?
By 2000, Seattle Slew's magnificent body was slowing down.
We found out that Slew had a neurological problem, and They thought, well, he might work out of it, might be a little arthritic, might be a, cold day. But he didn't work out of it, and he would go from side to side.
1977 Triple Crown winner Seattle Slew, one of the world's leading stallions, underwent successful surgery this past Sunday.
Once more, the Black Stallion recovered and at 27 was returned to the breeding shed in 2001 as the only living Triple Crown winner. Yet history viewed his career in the shadow of another.
He didn't have a long time to bask in the glory. It had been 25 years before Secretariat won his Triple Crown. And Slew came back 4 years later, and 1 year later, here we had another one.
If Affirmed and Alydar hadn't had their great rivalry the very next year, perhaps his Triple Crown legacy would have lasted a little longer. Bang, it was the very next year. But I don't think he's a forgotten horse. I think people in racing and general sports fans very much remember him.
Nobody before and nobody since has made it through the Triple Crown undefeated. And that's an achievement that just looks bigger and bigger with the passage of years.
He was a wonderful horse going into the Triple Crown. He was a wonderful horse in the Triple Crown, and he was a wonderful horse after the Triple Crown. And maybe some people were knocking him around the first Saturday in May and through the Belmont, but by the end of his career, he left no doubts.
While he was revered as the people's horse, Seattle Slew was taunted about his humble beginnings. But he more than had his redemption and his revenge. First, the commoner beat the kings on the racetrack, and then he repeated his triumph in the breeding barns. When his progeny were identified as offspring of the great Slew, the response was invariably the same: sold. For Sports Century, I'm Chris Fowler.